He came unannounced and made a big announcement. On a surprise trip to Kyiv, U.S. Secretary of State Antony Blinken pledged over $1 billion in additional aid for Ukraine. That includes over $665 million in new military and civilian security assistance. Over the past months, the debate over Washington's support for Ukraine had been growing louder, with many U.S. analysts voicing criticism over the slow progress of the counteroffensive. But Blinken's message was clear. Every inch of recovered territory is an achievement.
Now, since I was last here almost exactly 1 year ago, Ukrainian forces have taken back more than 50% of the territory seized by Russian forces since February of 2022. In the ongoing counteroffensive, progress has accelerated in the past few weeks. This new assistance will help sustain it and build further momentum. Today, with President Zelenskyy, I discussed longer-term sustainable security arrangements, which will provide ongoing security assistance and modern military equipment across land, air, sea, and cyberspace, as well as training and intelligence sharing.
Military analyst Frank Ledwidge joins me now. Frank, this is the highest level visit by a U.S. official since February when Joe Biden traveled to Kyiv. Why was it important for Blinken to visit now?
Well, good evening, Nicole. I think there are two reasons, and one of them you've already mentioned, and that is that it's a long time since one of the senior cabinet members of the United States government visited. So it's a pretty irregular event. And the second is really to ensure, I think, the support of the United States at a difficult time. Third is what Blinken himself said, and I think this is legitimate. He wanted to get some ground truth as to what was happening. He's going to be getting some fairly confidential briefings from the senior members of the Ukrainian government and, of course, military. I think that'll be very important for future decision-making at the very highest strategic level.
Yeah, and there has been a lot of complaining in the U.S. about not having enough oversight, so that might send a signal to the lawmakers worried about that. Now, in talks with Foreign Minister Kuleba, Blinken said he'd seen some good progress, but many in the Pentagon would dare to disagree. How is the counteroffensive really going?
Right, well, if I can be blunt here, not a single person in the Pentagon or in the United States has ever fought a high-end conventional war against a peer competitor, a peer enemy, such as the Russians. And I think they should be rather reluctant and reticent to be prescriptive about how Ukrainian generals fight this war. I've commanded in low-end combat, and so have they, at a fairly low end. I can tell you even there, it's extremely stressful. So to be prescriptive, I think, is uncalled for. But to answer your question, at the tactical level, things look a bit difficult, but they always do at the tactical level. It was never going to be easy, as they have always said, the Ukrainians. Bite and hold, sustainability is their keynote in this, and they're proceeding steadily.
Yeah. Blinken arrived on the day Ukrainian lawmakers approved the nomination of the new defense ministers. Will the reshuffle have consequences for Ukraine's allies?
I don't think so, save for that issue that you mentioned before. You just touched on it there, and I think it's really important, that corruption issue. Now, Reznikov himself was not personally associated, I think it's fair to say, in corruption. But the problem is that he presided over a system that evidently is. And there have been multiple examples there. We don't need to go through them. The new defense minister, of course, he's Crimean, very important. He hasn't been associated with that. He's generally regarded as clean. So I think that's the key message of this new minister, or two key messages: one, Crimea, and two, a clean brush, as it were.
Blinken pledged another aid package worth over $1 billion. Where is this support most needed right now? Where do the Ukrainians need it most acutely?
Right, well, we've heard a lot over the last year and a half about big-ticket items, the F-16s, the HIMARS, and so on. What the Ukrainian soldiers will want, and they're on the ground, of course, fighting, are the lower-end stuff. They want body armour, they want night vision, and above all, what's called armoured mobility, or indeed any kind of mobility, not only to assist in mobility on the battlefield, but of course evacuation of wounded, which right now is carried out either on foot or in unprotected vehicles. So if we were going to look at another category of aid, it would be that in very large quantities. The big ticket item on this, of course, or the keynote item, is uranium tipped shells for the forthcoming Abrams tanks. But They're very normal, a very normal part of the armoury, the anti-tank armoury of any army or any modern army.
You say they're a normal part, but there was a bit of discussion when they were first provided to the Ukrainian army by the Brits. How will the Ukrainians be able to use them, and why are they somewhat controversial?
Well, what they allow you to do, Nicole, is drill through enemy armour. It's as simple as that. Uranium or depleted uranium is extremely hard. It's much harder than most steel armour and indeed most armour, and it can penetrate very easily. And it's as simple as that, particularly in the smaller calibers. So it allows you versatility in anti-armour operations.
The Kremlin says U.S. aid will not influence the course of what they call the special military operation. That's, of course, far from the truth. But I do want to know from you how much of a difference the U.S. aid has actually made until today in Ukraine's war.
It's been utterly decisive. From the start, Javelin missiles, more of them coming, HIMARS, Patriot, the political pressure, which, I mean, they're a bit reluctant on this, on the tanks, but they're coming. I think what Ukraine would want, though, is a more strategic perspective on grants of weapons. And we're talking here, perhaps the United States might consider releasing some of the 2,500 Abrams tanks they have in their inventory, spare, as it were, in storage, rather than the 31 that are heading Ukraine's way. There's a lot more to come, and I suspect that's what President Zelenskyy may be discussing over the next couple of days or day or so with Mr. Blinken.
Blinken, while in Kyiv, said he wanted to make sure Ukraine has what it needs, not just now, but in the long term as well, to give Kyiv a strong deterrent, as he said. To Zelenskyy, that might sound like NATO membership, but what does he actually mean?
Yeah, the United States, and particularly President Biden, I think, is very reluctant. It's always been very reluctant, actually, for a couple of decades, to discuss NATO membership for Ukraine. I think that's going to be the case until the war finishes. I think that realistically, what will be discussed in this context is that sort of long-term perspective on weapons and security assistance. And that security assistance, of course, doesn't just take the form of armour and guns, a sort of hard edge of military capability, but also the softer edge, if you can call it that, cyber, space, reconnaissance, intelligence, and so forth that Mr. Blinken was talking about today. But it's all very well making these announcements every month or so, every 6 weeks. But what I think Ukraine wants is a guaranteed pipeline of this, because the key demands of an attritional war are sustainability, and the Ukrainians have always said that. And right now, this ad hoc approach, drip feed, it isn't really working.
Frank Ledwidge, thank you so much. Always great speaking to you.
Thank you, Matt.